Contracts are not just legal documents, they are decision infrastructure. They define what the business can charge, enforce, escalate, and protect. And in the AI era, that matters because AI can understand the data and still misunderstand the decision if it does not understand the contract. Today's conversation is about why contracts are the economic rules of the business and why value is realized after signature and why CLM alone is not the finish line. The real question is not just what does the data say? The real question is what does the contract allow us to do now? That is where contract intelligence becomes enterprise value. So when we talk about the execution gap, we have to talk about contracts because many of the rules that determine action are sitting inside agreements that most AI systems, dashboards, and business workflows still do not understand. In a World Commerce and Contracting 2025 white paper, it states that contracts touch every dollar of revenue and cost. Yet, in many organizations, they still remain fragmented, slow, rigid, and hard for business users to understand. Now, the same white paper states that poor contract management also causes an average of 9% of value loss annually, with the worst performers losing 15% or more. Now, this is the difference between having contracts under control and having contract value under control. Many companies have improved contract storage. Far fewer have improved contract activation. That is not a contract administration problem. This is an enterprise value problem. At World Commerce and Contract, they also point out that contract-related data is scattered across an average of 24 systems, making it difficult to track commitments or optimize decisions on time. And that number matters because it does not mean that the signed agreement is sitting in 24 places. It means that the data needed to understand, manage, enforce, and optimize a contract is fragmented across the enterprise. The signed agreement may be in the CLM, but the spend is in ERP, the customer relationship is in CRM, and the invoice is in accounts payable. The forecast is in finance, and the supplier risk is in a third-party platform. The approval history may be in an email, and the renewal tracker may still be in a spreadsheet. That is why value gets stuck, not because the contract lacks value, but because the value is disconnected from the systems, owners, and decisions that need to act on it. Now, when I say contracts are decision infrastructure, I am not saying that to make contracts sound more important than they are. I am saying it because contracts govern the decisions leaders make every day. They govern the pricing rights, the renewal windows, the consent requirements, the performance obligations. Those are not legal details sitting in the background. They are execution rules. They determine what action is possible. Contracts define how revenue is earned, how costs are managed, how risk is allocated, how performance is managed, how obligations are enforced, how relationships can be expanded, renewed, limited, or even exited. In other words, contracts define what the business can actually do. That is why contract intelligence is not just a legal capability. For the CFO, this is margin protection. For the CIO, this is AI context. For the general counsel, this is governed action. For procurement and operations, this is execution leverage. In other words, contract intelligence is an enterprise capability and increasingly an AI capability. Because if AI is going to recommend an action inside the enterprise, it needs to understand the rules that govern that action. Over the past year, the tariff environment made this very visible. When tariffs changed, companies did not only ask, what does the market data say? They had to ask, what does the contract allow us to do now? Reuters reported that after Howmet Aerospace declared a force majeure event tied to tariffs, aerospace companies, including plane makers, airlines, and suppliers, began reviewing billions of dollars of contracts to understand the exposure and to determine who would bear the added costs. That is contract decision infrastructure in action, not theory, action. A tariff hits, a cost shifts, margins change, suppliers react, customers push back, and suddenly leaders need to know who carries the cost. Can pricing change? And is there a force majeure clause? Can performance be suspended? Can the contract be renegotiated? Skaden's tariff guidance makes this point directly. Under US law, the importer of record is typically responsible for tariffs, but contract provisions may allocate that risk differently. Skaden also advises parties to evaluate their contracts to determine which tariffs apply and whether existing contract provisions allocate or mitigate the burden. And that is why contracts matter. Because in moments of volatility, contracts are not static records. They become the map of what the business can do next. In moments of volatility, the companies with contract intelligence know their options faster. The companies without it are left searching for leverage after the pressure has already arrived. And that is why a contract sitting in a repository is not enough. A repository can tell you that the contract exists. Decision infrastructure tells you what the contract allows, who owns the decision, and what action is available, and what value is at stake. Now, I want to be clear. CLM matters. Contract lifecycle management helps organizations manage drafting, negotiation, approvals, signatures, storage, and visibility. That is important. But CLM is not the full value system today. The finish line is not a signed contract. The finish line is value realization. And value realization happens after signature. A clause does not create value because it exists. A clause creates value when it is connected to a trigger, an owner, a decision, an action, and an outcome. That is the shift from contract management to contract intelligence, from contract storage to contract activation, from legal record to enterprise decision infrastructure. This is where many organizations get stuck. They believe they have solved the contract problem because they have centralized documents. But centralizing documents is not the same as activating decisions. Search is not the same as action. Visibility is not the same as ownership. A contract summary is not the same as a governed decision. Now, this is where AI enters the conversation. AI can summarize the contract, extract clauses, identify risk language, compare terms. AI can even answer questions about an agreement. Now, all of that is useful, but that is only the tip of the iceberg. The real question is not simply, can AI read the contract? The real question is, can AI understand the contract well enough to support the decision? Does it understand the pricing rights, consent requirements, performance obligations? Because those are not legal details just sitting in the background. They are the execution rules that determine what action is possible. AI may see margin erosion, but the contract determines whether pricing can change. AI may identify supplier risk, but the contract determines whether the company can audit, renegotiate, dual source, or even terminate. AI may identify missed revenue, but the contract determines whether that right still exists, whether notice was required, and whether the window to recover has closed. So, context around the contract is not optional. It is part of how AI becomes decision ready. So, let's make this practical. There are 3 common decision areas where contract intelligence changes the quality of enterprise action: pricing, risk, and value leakage. Going into pricing decisions, AI may identify margin erosion. It may recommend a price increase. It may detect that costs have moved, discounts are too deep, or revenue quality is weakening. But pricing is not just an analytical decision. It is a contract governed decision. The business has to ask, is pricing adjustable? Is notice required? Is customer consent required? Are there caps, floors, or index terms? Those answers determine whether the recommendation is executable. Without contract intelligence, pricing AI can create conflict and breach. Finance wants margin protection. Sales worries about the customer relationship. Legal needs to confirm contract rights. The business delays. And by the time action happens, the margin opportunity may already be gone. Pricing intelligence becomes valuable when it is connected to contract rights, decision ownership, and governed action. Supplier risk is another example. AI may detect supplier exposure, a disruption risk, a tariff issue, a financial weakness, a performance decline. But the signal is only the beginning. The decision depends on the contract. Can we audit? Can we use an alternate supplier? Can we require remediation? Can we terminate? Are there minimum commitments or exclusivity restrictions? Now, those rules matter because supplier risk is not just a risk signal, it is a contract governed decision. The organization needs procurement, finance, operations, and legal aligned around what the agreement allows, what the business needs, and what action protects value. And the third example is value leakage. This is where contracts quietly lose money. Missed rebates, unused credits, unenforced service levels, auto renewals no one intended, and payment terms that are not optimized. These are not always dramatic losses. They are often quiet, small misses repeated over time across many agreements, across many teams. That is how value leaks. Not because the contract had no value, but because no one connected the term to a trigger, an owner, and an action. Contract intelligence helps the organization see where value should have been protected, recovered, or escalated. So, what should leaders do differently? The 10x move is to stop treating contracts as static records and start treating them as decision infrastructure. That means connecting key terms to 5 things: a trigger, owner, rules, action, and outcome. The first, trigger. What event should activate the term? A renewal date, a price change, a missed service level, a tariff event, supplier disruption, a rebate threshold. You have to identify the triggers. Second, owner. Who owns the decision when the trigger appears? Not who sees it in the dashboard, not who stores the contract, who owns the decision. Number 3, what contract term, policy, or obligation governs the action? What does the agreement allow? What does it require? And what does it restrict? Fourth, what should happen next? Renegotiate, escalate, enforce, notify, recover, block, or even just monitor. Now, the 5th is the outcome. How will the organization know value moved, margin recovered, leakage avoided, risk reduced, cash flow improved, cycle time shortened, most importantly, revenue protected? For example, if a tariff event occurs, that is the trigger. Procurement or finance may own the decision. The rule may sit in a price adjustment, force majeure, or change in law clause. The action may be notice, renegotiation, escalation, or cost recovery. The outcome is whether margin was protected or value was lost. That is contract decision infrastructure. It is not just knowing what the contract says, it is knowing what the business can do. So, here are the questions I believe leaders should be asking. not just legal leaders, enterprise leaders. First, what decisions in our business are governed by contract terms? Second, who owns the action when a contract risk or opportunity appears? And finally, can AI access the rules needed to recommend the right action? Those questions change the conversation. They move contracts out of the back office and they move contract data out of the repository. They move AI beyond summarization and they move leaders closer to the real issue. Can the enterprise act on the intelligence it already has? The future of contract intelligence is not just retrieval, it is governed action. It is knowing what the business can do, who owns the decision, what rules apply, and how value moves. Contracts are not just records of agreement, they are decision infrastructure. Contracts are where enterprise strategy becomes executable. They define what the business can charge, recover, enforce, escalate, and protect. And in the AI era, that all matters because AI can surface the signal. The data can reveal the pattern. The dashboard can show the risk. But if leaders do not understand the contract terms that govern the decision, insight can stall before it becomes action. That is why contract intelligence matters, not as a legal exercise, not as document management, but as a business capability. If this conversation resonated, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where do contracts sit in your organization today? As documents, as data, or as decision rules? Thank you for joining this conversation. Share it with a leader who is trying to turn AI, data, and contract insight into measurable business value. See you next time.